Hello and welcome. This is a podcast explaining Ukraine by UkraineWorld.org, a website in English about Ukraine. Today we will talk about our trip to Chernihiv, northern Ukraine, which heavily suffered from the war, from the destruction. We will share with you what we have seen, what people have we met. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm chief editor of UkraineWorld.org, and I am joined by Tatiana Oharkova, who is in charge of international outreach at Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Hello, Tanya.
Hello.
Ukraine World is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of the oldest and biggest Ukrainian media NGO. Before we start, let me remind you that you can always support us on Patreon, patreon.com/UkraineWorld. We spend a big amount of your donations to help people who suffered from the war, to help Ukrainian resistance, and to do those volunteer trips that we are making, in particular that one in Chernihiv. So let's talk about this region, and let's start maybe by explaining what is Chernihiv, why it is important not to confuse it with other cities, because I will tell you a story that I posted some of the videos from our trip to Chernihiv, and a person told me that, maybe from Romania, that the city is actually called Chernovic. So obviously there is a confusion, because Chernovic or Chernivtsi or Chernauci is a city in Bukovina in western Ukraine. We are talking about Chernihiv in northern Ukraine. What is Chernihiv and why it is important?
Well, Chernihiv is really very important city in Ukraine, even if it's not the biggest one. So the population before the war was around 270,000 population there. But it is at the same time one of the most ancient cities in Ukraine, close to Kyiv, 150 kilometers to the north of Kyiv, close to Belarus. So this is important strategically in this war. One of the most beautiful, because you have a lot of churches, a lot of Ukrainian ancient churches. When we traveled to Chernihiv in peaceful times, it was to visit churches of the 11th century, 10th century as well, to visit monasteries, to visit caves, and really beautiful nature. They have this Desna river there in Chernihiv, and beautiful parks and beautiful architecture. So Chernihiv was...
This is a medieval city, right? With the big history, which dates back to the Middle Ages, to the Rus, the Kievan Rus, and Chernihiv princes were a little bit maybe less important than Kiev princes, but still a very, very big city at the time.
That's why it was so painful in the first days of war. I do remember when we learned about this first challenge of Chernihiv, we were very much worried about its architecture, about its people for sure, but also about this architecture, about houses, about monasteries, about churches. So all that beautiful things we observed many times. We traveled many times to Chernihiv before the war, and we do know that many tourists, many international people who arrive here in Kyiv, they like to spend 1 day or 2 days traveling to the city just to enjoy this beautiful nature and these landscapes and views. So it was very painful to know from the first days of the war, that Chernihiv was shelled. Then it was surrounded on the three sides by Russian troops. They stayed extremely close to the city, even if they sometimes entered the city. So what we knew, later in March, we learned that Chernihiv was cut off from Kyiv. The bridge was destroyed, the main bridge coming to Chernihiv. Unfortunately, we know people who died, who were killed on their way to Chernihiv. For example, people transporting humanitarian aid, because the city was besieged for many weeks, and we imagined a disastrous situation on the ground, and some people, some volunteers and military, they were trying to get access to the city to import humanitarian aid. It is difficult to express how happy we were when we learned that Chernihiv was liberated and that Russian troops left the region. And this trip was very important for us to see what does it look like after this departure of Russian troops. It was not occupied. So Chernihiv protected. In a way, we can say that Chernihiv protected Kyiv, at least from one direction.
The people in Chernihiv, and we totally agree with them, told us the following phrase: "If Ukraine is a shield of Europe, then Chernihiv is a shield of Kyiv."
They are absolutely right. Russians, they were approaching Kyiv from many directions. One direction is from the eastern part, like they were approaching Brovary. They were not approaching from Chernihiv direction, but from Priluki direction. But Chernihiv is somehow more north, in the north, and they were trying to get this big road linking Chernihiv and Kyiv, so very highway, really good road, broad road. They were incapable to do so. If they managed, for example, to control this road, I think they will be very soon here in Brovary and later in Kyiv. So it was a very important resistance point of Ukrainian resistance around Chernihiv. They were strong enough to keep for more than 1 month, because they started in the last days of February and the whole month of March. So and then
March was a really difficult month for everything which is, for everything which is around Kyiv, right? So for Kyiv, for suburbs, for villages around Kyiv, for Bucha, obviously, for Borodyanka that we visited before, and for Chernihiv as well. And let's tell some stories. So Chernihiv has a specific geography. I think it's like 15 kilometers to 12 kilometers. So it's kind of a square city, and therefore it is compact. It's very pleasant to travel to walk around, because everything is close. But at the same time, from the military point of view, it is very fragile. And the shellings were from both sides of the city. From on the one side, on the one outskirts, there were Russians. On the other outskirts, there were Ukrainians, and people inside were just in between this constant shelling. So they were seeing the shells, the missiles, the flying over them for a month, and they learned how to differentiate by sound the different shells, the different type of shells, but also who is actually shooting. Is it Ukrainians or is it Russians?
And the direct result of that artillery positions is that when you observe now Chernihiv, you see that the center of the city is almost not destroyed. But when you travel, when you go out a little bit and you approach the outskirts of the city, you see complete ruins everywhere. Like, for example, in Bobrovitsa, maybe, it's like Saltivka in Kharkiv. So it is northeast direction, so the closest direction to Russia. So, and there their positions were, and you see in huge residential area, one-story buildings, private houses, most of they're completely destroyed. There is no single house which is left in its normal state.
Yes. You at some areas of this Bobrovitsa, every single house is destroyed. There is a difference between Bobrovitsa and Saltivka in Kharkiv, because Saltivka is a multi-store buildings, 16-floor buildings, big residential buildings. Bobrovitsa is mostly looks like a village, right? So small private houses. And what we have been told by the authorities is that 148, if I'm not mistaken, multi-store buildings had direct shelling. So they suffered from direct bombing, shelling.
Direct shelling or bombing, because there were also jets arriving and...
So 148 and 2,000 private small houses, right? So 2,000, can you imagine? 2,000 houses either damaged or destroyed.
Yeah, and about victims, so also authorities told us about the victims, about 1,000 people were killed during this military operation, these hostilities during 1 month, and most of them were killed by shellings, because Russian troops were not on the ground, and among them, unfortunately, 16 children. At the same time, a lot of families left Chernihiv in the first days of this full-scale invasion, because Russian troops arrived extremely quickly to Chernihiv. It's extremely close to the border. You can look at the Google map and you'll see how close it is to Belarus. And about 70,000 out of 270,000 in the beginning of the war. So only 70,000 left. Left during this state. We met people who stayed during these hard times for Chernihiv, and they told us a lot of interesting and heartbreaking stories.
Yes, we met volunteers from the organization which is called Balsanka, and very brave people, young women, and lots of stories that they told us. One of them is Vera Kuriko, who is a very talented Ukrainian reporter. So maybe she will publish something on this, and she already published several books. And let's not forget that the city during 1 month was without electricity and without water. So it was like in Mariupol, right? So what's happening when you don't have electricity? Nothing is functioning, actually. You can't get water, for example, the drinking water. And
about water, it's different a little bit. They had water, but there were no water in houses. So let's explain it.
That's what I'm trying to explain. So contrary to Mariupol, where we had those heartbreaking stories that people were melting snow to get water, it was in March. And imagine a city in March, very cold. There is still snow outside, so the temperature is minus something Celsius. Imagine how you, for example, there is no heating, of course, no electricity, no heating. Imagine how you sleep during the night. So it's especially if you are in a bomb shelter. So apart from these horrible shellings, there are also very harsh conditions for life. And Chernihiv also, without electricity, without water, but Chernihiv has access to deep water, deep underground water, and therefore despite this company Vodokanal, we call it in Ukraine, a company which is supplying water, many of its utilities were specifically targetedly destroyed by the Russians, and Russians really target infrastructure. The infrastructure which is helps the city to survive if it is encircled, if it is surrounded. So it's typical. It repeats from the city to the city, and but this Vodokanal was still getting water from the underground. They went through people and just distributing. So imagine lines of people staying for the water, lines of many dozens and hundreds in each district.
By the way, the water in Chernihiv is something really extraordinary because the source is really deep in the underground, 700 meters. So, and they were getting this water from the underground in peaceful times as well. So it's very clean water. It's natural water. It's not water from from the river, which was distillated or whatever, or purified in a way. It was really this water. And then this company, they tried to distribute it among population just in this, using these cars, But the system was a very complicated one because they were hesitant to publish anything online because Russians... We do remember, maybe everybody remembers that this tragic episode when the Russians shelled into a line of people who were just in front of the shop to get bread. It happened in March, and we remember this terrible picture. So they were trying to do so with water as well. So for this water company to distribute water, they were trying to explain people where is the exact place where they will be distributing water, but using the language Russians will never understand. For example, they were describing, so at 5 a.m., so we'll start distributing water in a district where it was extremely hard to get to construct trolleybus line. So, and people who were local, they were, for them it was clear where the place is, but for Russians it was not clear. So they were trying to hide exact places and what they were going to do.
So it's a very specific thing how language is used during the war, right? How you should say something that your enemy will hear but not understand, right? So there is also a question of deciphered, or how to say it, deciphered or ciphered language, the encoded language, right? So you need to use some codes which are understood.
And maybe the last detail about this line of people to get bread. So the local people, these volunteers from Balsanka unit, Balsanka organization, they told us this tragic story, because that day people arrived to get bread and they were told that there will be no bread today. But still they were making line, just hoping that maybe it's not true, maybe they will bring the bread, so they were maybe hungry. They were staying in this line, and at that time Russians shelled at them, so everybody was killed.
Coming back to water, Chernihiv is very famous for its beer. Both industrial production, the Chernihivsky brand, which is very popular in Ukraine, and those foreigners who are coming to Ukraine surely know this beer. But also, my favorite beer, I'm actually not a beer drinker, but my favorite craft beer, I mean in a private craft breweries, was from Chernihiv. And unfortunately, both this big industrial factory and this craft beer were destroyed by the Russians. I hope Ukraine will rebuild it, but it is also kind of a gastronomical heritage which we will lack. Other stories which were told us is that the life under this war is very specific. For example, money don't matter. You cannot buy anything, and there is some other economy which is going on during the war. The economy in which you exchange goods. Goods are very contingent, so one time you exchange a package of a fish for a cigarette. Cigarettes are very important currency for those who smoke, because they cannot survive without smoking. And the key goods are cigarettes, sugar, and salt. And why salt is important? Because no electricity, no refrigerators. Salt is the only way for you to save food, to preserve food. For example, meat. Mm-hmm. The only way how you can preserve meat is by salting it, right? So these are the stories.
So this is about the fragility of civilization, what we also experience here in Kyiv, but what we've been told in Chernihiv, it's even bigger. So the very single day the war starts, and then you lose your normal way of life, and there is no money, it doesn't matter, there is no public transport, it doesn't matter. So there is only cars if you have one, and if you have the possibility to get gas for your car. You are not in security anywhere, wherever you are, so you hear these shellings, these planes constantly. You struggle to get some food. You exchange things you have against things you need. Some people, and the stories they told, that humanitarian aid is also something sometimes very funny. But when, for example, volunteers were contacted by a company producing chicken somewhere out of occupation, they were preparing to move, maybe to the west. We don't know exactly, but they were preparing a lot of chicken, and they suggested these people in Chernihiv, in this volunteer network, to transport 20 tons of chicken. Just do you need 20 tons of chicken? They, yes, indeed, we do need these 20 tons of chickens. Although they're arriving with the big trucks, they bring these 20 tons of chicken, but then they get to know that other volunteers, they were also proposed these 20 tons of chicken. So everybody in Chernihiv had access to this chicken. So, and it was maybe the most popular food for a week, because everybody was eating the same product, but only chicken, nothing more. You don't have bread, you don't have water, but you have your chicken
for breakfast, for lunch, for dinner, during the night.
The other week you have oranges, for example. Oranges arriving like humanitarian aid, and all the 70,000 people living in Chernihiv, they're eating only oranges because volunteers brought them oranges. And you exchange, so you try to exchange your chicken against something more interesting, but you cannot, because everybody has chicken, but nobody has anything more interesting. And this story told by one volunteer, she is a smoker, and she told us a story when she bought 1 kilogram of fish, and she lived with a kind of a family. And then she was there with this package of fish in her hands, and she sees a man who starts to smoke, and she asks him, "Could you please give me a cigarette?" And he looks at her and she says, "Okay, but could you give me your fish?" And she was so eager to smoke that she exchanged this 1 kilogram of fish, frozen fish if I'm not mistaken, against 1 cigarette. And she comes back and she tells the story to her friend who was living with the family, and she's also happy because she's also a smoker. But apart from this friend, there is a mother and 3 kids, and they are looking quite differently.
Suspiciously. I think it was Vera Kurika whom we mentioned who told us this story, right? Another dramatic thing is that there are cultural sites which are destroyed. There is a library founded by the Tarnovsky family, very very important for Chernihiv and for the oblast. And also, I think one of the most tragic buildings, this which you mentioned, the Hotel Ukraine, very symbolically. Half of the building have collapsed after the airstrikes. So this is
a missile strike somehow. So a kind of symbol of Chernihiv, where every tourist knows this hotel. So it is the very center of the city. So it's a real tragedy, and without any explanation. I don't know. Russian propaganda was saying about some maybe foreign soldiers staying at this hotel, but it doesn't look really like that.
We also traveled in the region. We visited 2 villages. One is called Ichnya, another is called Parafivka. We met the local dwellers. We traveled with PEN Ukraine. We did mention it. PEN Ukraine, which is a Ukrainian writers and human rights defender organization, very active. So we brought these people some books, very open people. We had a frank discussion actually with them, with other Ukrainian writers. And we also traveled to Kachanivka, which is a fantastic place, fantastic, very beautiful natural park.
And historically also very important, because a lot of famous people like Shevchenko, like Gogol, like Markovovchok, like Glinka, the composer, Russian composer, were there. They were the guests of the family of Tarnovsky. Tarnovsky was the owner for many years. 2 generations of Tarnovsky were owners of this palace, and nowadays you can stay in this palace in itself. In fact, almost in the palace. It's like hotel, so you can just rent it for 1 night or several nights as well, in a beautiful park. And we were happy enough to see that Kachanivka was not touched by the war. It was quite far away from these main roads. Russian army was approaching Kyiv, so they were lucky during this invasion. But this is one of the most significant places in Ukraine to visit after the war, for sure.
And there is also one of the important places which we visited before the war, or last year, just for our purposes, which is Baturin. One of the Ukrainian hetman's capital city.
It's symbolic.
And very symbolic also if you compare with Chernihiv, because the Russian troops were completely destroyed the city after Ivan Mazepa joined Swedish King Charles XII during the Second Northern War. And this was one of the episodes of Ukraine's fight for independence. So Russians completely destroyed the city and massacred all its population. So this was also an act of genocide. And we see that how the things are repeating.
Maybe let's explain the last thing about the transport, about how do you travel in Ukraine after the war. So in order to get to Chernihiv, you cannot follow the normal road. So the direct road from Kyiv to Chernihiv, because the bridge just when you enter Chernihiv, normally you have to cross the bridge. This bridge was destroyed in the end of March. So now you had to, and there is not a lot of bridges in Desna, so for this river Desna. So you have to turn left in the Oster city, Oster village, and then you continue to the north. It takes much more time. But locals, what they do, not to drive longer, because the gas is also hard to find and it is expensive. What they do is they drive to this destroyed bridge, and then they cross the bridge by foot They get into Chernihiv, they do whatever they want.
They cross the pedestrian bridge, not the destroyed bridge.
Yeah, not destroyed, but pedestrian, another one, but close to this one, which was destroyed. And then if they need to go out of the city, they cross the river by foot, and then they arrive to their car, which is parked just in front of this destroyed bridge. They take the car and they travel to Kyiv.
There are very few bridges over Desna. Desna is a fantastic river in Ukraine, one of our favorite. We're living close to Desna, but there is not so many ways to cross it. But this is the story. This was a story about Chernihiv, a city, also a city fortress, we can say, a city that in many cases saved or helped to save Kyiv, a city which was attacked from the Russian territory, but also from the Belarusian territory, unfortunately. And now the city is coming back to life, but of course is living also with a very tense situation because Russians continue their missile strikes.
About 200,000 people are already back, so out of 270,000.
Yes. So this was a Explaining Ukraine podcast. Tetiana Harkova and Volodymyr Yermolenko. You can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/UkraineWorld. We send a big amount of your donations to help people who suffered from the war and to help Ukrainian resistance. Follow us in social networks and stay with us and stand with Ukraine.